My name is Isabelle, I'm 29, and for as long as I can remember, I've lived in my brother Daniel's shadow. If there was ever a moment in my life where I was allowed to shine without his drama or my parents' favoritism overshadowing it, I honestly can't recall it. I thought this was just how families worked. Some people get all the attention, and others learn to live without it. I told myself I didn't mind. But eventually, even the quietest person reaches their breaking point. For me, it was in San Francisco, when my dad started yelling at me and grabbed my hand, demanding I do something I couldn't agree to. That was the moment everything changed. We grew up in Milwaukee, in a quiet neighborhood where the lawns were trimmed neatly and summer nights smelled of barbecues and cut grass. From the outside, we looked like an ordinary family. Dad, Frank, working in construction management, Mom, Marjorie, keeping the books for a local dental office, me, the older child, and Daniel, 2 years younger, with his endless appetite for attention. Inside our house, the rules were unspoken but unyielding. Daniel's feelings came first. Always. If he had a school recital, the whole family revolved around it. If he had a tantrum, and he had plenty, the household adjusted to soothe him. And me? I was the capable one. The strong one. The one who didn't need as much. That's what my parents said whenever I dared to point out the unfairness. One of my earliest memories of this double standard still stings. Daniel was in 2nd grade, and he came home beaming with a Most Improved Reader certificate. Mom clapped, Dad ruffled his hair, and the paper went straight onto the refrigerator door where every visitor could admire it. That same year, I was in middle school, and I won 1st place in the district science fair. I came home with a ribbon and a plaque, my heart soaring, only to hear Mom say, "That's great, Izzy," before turning back to help Daniel with his Lego set. My plaque never made it to the kitchen. It ended up on a dusty shelf in my bedroom, invisible except to me. The older I got, the more this pattern solidified. On my 16th birthday, I had been saving for 2 years to buy myself a battered old Honda that coughed smoke when it started. I loved it anyway. It was mine, bought with hours of bagging groceries. When Daniel turned 16, he got a shiny, used Jeep as a surprise from my parents, complete with a bow on top. He didn't even have to ask. I told myself I didn't care, but that night, lying awake, I couldn't shake the bitterness of knowing effort got me scraps while his entitlement got him gifts. Even our bedrooms reflected the divide. Mine stayed painted in the same pale yellow we'd chosen when we moved into the house. When I asked if I could repaint, Mom brushed me off. "You don't care about things like that, Izzy. You're practical." Meanwhile, Daniel's room was redone every other year. New paint, new furniture, strings of LED lights, even a gaming chair he'd begged for. He lived like a prince, while I learned to swallow disappointment and wear practicality like a badge of honor. The unspoken family script went like this: Daniel made mistakes, and the world bent to fix them. I succeeded, and the world told me I didn't need recognition. If Daniel forgot his homework, Mom drove it to school. If I forgot mine, Dad scolded me for being careless. If Daniel sulked, Mom coddled him. If I complained, I was told I was too dramatic. I learned early on that in our family, Daniel's neediness was treated like currency, while my strength was treated like an excuse to neglect me. By high school, I'd stopped expecting fairness. I buried myself in academics, knowing nobody was going to hand me anything. I graduated near the top of my class and earned a scholarship to a design program in Madison. I worked 2 jobs to cover what the scholarship didn't, pulling late nights and living on ramen. Meanwhile, Daniel drifted in and out of community college, switching majors every semester, and Mom and Dad footed every bill without hesitation. I remember one Thanksgiving when I drove home exhausted after a week of 50-hour shifts between classes and freelance design work. At dinner, Dad asked me politely how school was going. I got halfway through explaining that I was set to graduate early when Daniel cut in to say he was thinking about maybe majoring in business. For the rest of the night, the conversation revolved around Daniel's vague plans, as though my real progress barely existed. The truth is, I learned to survive by lowering my expectations. If I wanted recognition, I had to give it to myself. If I wanted independence, I had to build it brick by brick. And I did. I graduated, landed a job at a design firm in Milwaukee, and eventually got my own apartment. I hosted a dinner to celebrate my first salaried position, inviting Mom, Dad, and Daniel. They showed up 45 minutes late because Daniel had needed to stop at the mall. That night, the only thing they complimented was his new jacket. My cooking, my apartment, my achievement, none of it mattered. For years, I told myself maybe things would change when Daniel and I were both adults. Maybe once we were on equal footing, my parents would see me as more than the sturdy backdrop to Daniel's drama. But deep down, I knew better. Patterns this ingrained don't fade with age, they calcify. And even at 29, I still found myself hoping for the smallest scraps of recognition, even as I braced for disappointment. That's the story of my life in Daniel's shadow. Until San Francisco. Until the moment my father reached for my hand, demanding I hand over my car keys for Daniel's sake. That was the night the script broke. When Dad first mentioned San Francisco for his 60th birthday, I thought it sounded modest, even sweet. He said he wanted something simple, just a long weekend with the family, maybe a nice dinner, a walk along the bay, perhaps even a ferry ride if the weather held. For a moment, I let myself believe it might actually be about him this time. But with my family, everything eventually bends toward Daniel. It always does. It started small. Mom called one night, her voice lilting with excitement, and said, "You know, we could also celebrate Daniel's fresh start. He's really turning things around at work." I had to bite my tongue. Daniel's fresh start meant he'd managed to hold a job for 6 months at a marketing firm after quitting 2 others in the span of a year. Meanwhile, I'd been grinding at the same design firm for years, managing deadlines and clients. Nobody had ever suggested a vacation for my stability. The more the trip took shape, the clearer it became that this wasn't just Dad's birthday, it was another stage for Daniel. Mom asked me if I could help out by booking the rental car, since I was so organized with those things. Of course, she didn't ask Daniel. She never did. Dad casually mentioned that maybe I could research restaurants too. And when Daniel chimed in that he wanted to see Alcatraz, the plan tilted completely, as if it were his birthday instead of Dad's milestone. Still, I told myself I could manage. I stayed late at the office, clearing deadlines and arranging project handoffs so I could leave without guilt. I drafted handover notes for my team, scheduled posts in advance, and even left a contingency plan in case a client panicked while I was away. By Friday, my desk was clean, my email inbox under control. I had earned those 3 days. Daniel, of course, did nothing to prepare. When I texted him about what time he'd be leaving for the airport, he replied, "Not sure yet, prob last min lol." That was Daniel in a nutshell, no effort, no plan, just the assurance that someone else would smooth things over. I flew out early Friday morning, a coffee sweating in my hand as the plane lifted above the gray Milwaukee sky. San Francisco greeted me with crisp air and the scent of salt from the bay. The city always felt like a postcard come to life, pastel houses clinging to hillsides, cable cars rattling along tracks, fog spilling over the Golden Gate. For a moment, as I wheeled my suitcase through the airport, I let myself believe maybe this trip could be different. I picked up the rental car at the airport, my name, my license, my credit card. The clerk handed me the keys with a professional smile, and I felt that small satisfaction of knowing I had planned ahead, done things properly, and earned control of this piece of the trip. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. The hotel was near Union Square, one of those glossy high-rises with mirrored glass and a lobby that smelled faintly of citrus and disinfectant. I checked in smoothly, my room waiting just as I'd reserved it. I texted the family group chat, "I'm here. Checking in now." Mom replied with 3 heart emojis. Daniel's only contribution was, "Save me a spot." They arrived hours later, sweeping into the lobby like a familiar storm. Dad moved with purpose, already impatient with the check-in line. Mom trailed behind, wide-eyed at the chandeliers. Daniel followed last, dragging his suitcase with one hand, phone in the other, his face lit by the screen. He gave me a quick hug, perfumed and distracted, then immediately asked, "So where are the keys?" "Keys?" I echoed. "Rental car," he said, as though it were obvious. "I'll drive us around. You don't like city driving anyway." I blinked at him, stunned by the entitlement. He hadn't even asked if I'd gotten the car, just assumed it was waiting for him. "Daniel, you don't even have your license with you." He shrugged, grinning. "So? Who's gonna check? It's just easier if I drive." Dad cut in with that familiar, clipped tone. "Come on, Isabelle. Hand him the keys. Don't make this a thing." I felt the first twinge of heat in my chest. This was supposed to be Dad's birthday trip, and already the script was unfolding. Daniel wanted something. Dad backed him up. And I was expected to fold. I tried reason. "I rented the car in my name. I'm responsible for it. If anything happens, it's on me." "It doesn't make sense." Dad's eyes narrowed. "Don't argue. He just wants to feel included. Give him the keys." There it was. That word, included. As though Daniel were a fragile child who couldn't bear the thought of being a passenger. As though my role, as always, was to absorb the inconvenience so he wouldn't have to. I clenched my fists around the key ring, feeling the cool bite of metal against my palm. A quiet voice inside me whispered, "Not this time." The lobby was too bright, all glass and polished marble, the kind of place where you can see yourself reflected at every angle. I caught sight of my own face in one of the mirrored columns, calm on the outside, but with that familiar tightness pulling at my jaw. I knew this script by heart. Daniel wanted something, Dad backed him, Mom smoothed the edges, and I disappeared. But this time, I was holding the keys. Daniel reached out his hand as if I'd already agreed. "Come on, Izzy. You hate driving in new cities. Just let me handle it." "I don't hate driving," I said evenly. "I rented the car in my name. I'll drive." He laughed like I'd told a joke. "Don't be ridiculous. You're too cautious. You drive like a grandma. I'll make it fun." "Daniel," I said, sharper now, "you don't even have your license with you." He rolled his eyes. "Who's gonna care? Nobody checks. You're being uptight." Dad stepped closer, his voice lowering into that warning growl I knew too well. "Isabelle. Stop making this difficult. It's just a car. Give him the keys." And there it was, the familiar dismissal, the flattening of my reasoning into obstinacy. It didn't matter that Daniel was unprepared, irresponsible, even illegal in this case. What mattered was keeping him happy. I tightened my grip on the keys. "No. I'm responsible for this rental. If anything happens, it's on me. He's not driving." Daniel's smirk deepened, the one that had haunted me since childhood. He leaned back on his heels, arms crossed, already certain of the outcome. He'd seen it play out 100 times. I'd hold out, Dad would press harder, Mom would plead, and eventually I'd fold to keep the peace. Dad's eyes flicked around the lobby. A couple stood nearby with luggage carts, pretending not to eavesdrop. That only made him angrier. He hated scenes in public. He stepped forward, and before I could react, his hand clamped around mine, rough and commanding, trying to pry the keys from my grip. "Enough," he hissed. "Don't ruin this trip. Hand them over." The shock of it, his fingers digging into my skin, the sudden physicality of it, froze me for a beat. I was 29 years old, not a teenager, but in that moment I was yanked back to every childhood argument where force replaced reason. My chest tightened, heat flaring in my face. Then something inside me snapped. I yanked my hand free, the keys clinking against each other, my voice rising louder than I meant. "No. Not this time." The sound echoed against the marble floors, sharp enough to make Daniel's smirk falter. Mom gasped softly, her hand fluttering to her necklace. Dad's face darkened, jaw tight, a shade I'd seen only a handful of times before. "Isabelle," Mom whispered urgently. "Please, don't start. You know how sensitive your brother is. Just let him." "I'm tired of letting him," I cut in, my voice trembling but steady. "I bend, and bend, and bend, and nobody ever notices what it costs me. You don't see it because you're too busy protecting him from the slightest discomfort. But I'm done." Daniel scoffed from behind Dad. "God, you're so dramatic. It's just a car." "It's never just a car," I shot back. My pulse was pounding, but the words came clear, like they'd been waiting years to surface. "It's always me giving up so he can take more. Always. Not anymore." The silence that followed was suffocating. A bellhop pushed a cart past, eyes flicking to us before looking away. Dad stared at me, calculating, the way he did when he was deciding whether to double down or retreat. But instead of apologizing or backing off, he leaned closer, voice low and dangerous. "You are being selfish," he said. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By embarrassing us? By making your brother miserable on my birthday?" My throat burned. The words stung because I'd heard them before, in different variations, all my life. Selfish. Dramatic. Ungrateful. The labels they used whenever I wanted something for myself. But this time, something steadier rose beneath the shame. Relief. Because I finally understood, no matter how much I gave up, it would never be enough. The only way the script would change was if I rewrote it. I slipped the keys into my pocket, squared my shoulders, and met Dad's glare head-on. "If respect isn't part of this trip, then I'm not staying. Drive yourselves around however you want. But I'm keeping my keys." Daniel's mouth dropped open, as though I'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. Mom's eyes welled with tears. Dad looked like he might explode. And me? For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like the afterthought. I felt like someone who had drawn a line. I didn't wait for Dad's response. If I stood there another second, I knew the gravity of old habits would pull me back into compliance. That was how it always worked. My resistance burned hot for a moment, then cooled under their pressure. But this time, something inside me stayed lit. I turned on my heel, the hotel lobby spinning with light and chatter. Mom's voice followed me, thin and pleading, "Isabelle, please, don't be unreasonable." Daniel muttered something under his breath that I didn't catch, but I knew the tone, mocking, smug, confident that I'd come crawling back. Dad didn't speak again. His silence was heavier than shouting. The elevator doors dinged behind me as I pushed through the glass entryway. Outside, the San Francisco air hit me sharp and cool, laced with salt from the bay and the exhaust of cabs pulling up to the curb. I breathed it in like oxygen after being trapped too long underwater. My hands were shaking as I crossed the sidewalk toward the garage. The keys felt heavy in my pocket, not just metal now but something symbolic, proof that I hadn't folded, not yet. My phone buzzed over and over, the family group chat lighting up. "Dad, come back right now. Don't embarrass us. Mom, honey, please. We'll sort this out if you calm down. Daniel, LMAO, you're so dramatic. Just hand over the keys already." I didn't reply. Instead, I slid behind the wheel of the rental car, the leather seat hugging me in a way that felt almost protective. The engine hummed to life with a turn of the key, solid and obedient. I sat there for a long moment, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was flushed, my chest tight, but beneath it all was something steadier than panic, clarity. If I turned the car off and went back inside, the ending was already written. They'd smooth things over, Daniel would get his way, and I'd lie awake that night furious at myself for caving yet again. The thought made my stomach twist. The other option shimmered in front of me, wild but undeniable: drive away. Claim space for myself, even if it meant being called selfish, dramatic, ungrateful. My pulse quickened, not from fear but from possibility. I shifted into drive. The garage spiraled upward, concrete glowing under fluorescent lights. When I emerged onto the street, the city stretched out in front of me, steep hills stacked with painted houses, cable cars clanging in the distance, fog hovering like a curtain at the bay's edge. Traffic surged, horns blaring, neon signs flashing. It all felt too loud, too chaotic, as though the outside world were mimicking the noise in my head. I didn't have a destination in mind, only a direction, a way. North felt right. I merged onto the highway, climbing the Bay Bridge as the city shrank in my rearview mirror. The water below shimmered with the reflection of streetlights, dark and restless. For the first time in years, I wasn't following a script. Beyond the bridge, the landscape loosened. Billboards gave way to rolling hills, and the horizon widened. The further I drove, the lighter I felt, as if each mile peeled away a layer of obligation. My phone buzzed again, lighting up with notifications. I silenced it and tossed it face down onto the passenger seat. The sudden quiet inside the car felt enormous. I stopped at a gas station somewhere outside Santa Rosa. The lot was bathed in harsh fluorescent light, insects battering themselves against the lamps in frantic rhythm. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and cleaner. I bought a bottle of water and a packet of almonds, my hands still trembling as I handed over a crumpled bill. Back in the car, I scrolled through nearby places to stay. A small inn in Mendocino popped up, cliffside views, starlit patios, only one room left. My savings flashed through my mind, but before doubt could creep in, I tapped book now. The confirmation email chimed, soft and final. The drive stretched long into the night. The highway curved and narrowed, the darkness pressing closer as the ocean came into view. I rolled the window down, letting the cold salt air whip through my hair. The road hummed beneath the tires, steady and sure, like a heartbeat. When I finally pulled into the inn's gravel lot, the building crouched low against the cliffs, strings of warm bulbs swaying in the coastal wind. I cut the engine, and silence fell so completely that the ticking of the car's cooling hood sounded like a metronome guiding me back into my own rhythm. Inside, the lobby was small and homey, wooden beams, a stone fireplace, the faint scent of seaweed carried in on guests' jackets. A woman in a cardigan looked up from behind the desk, her smile gentle but not intrusive. "Long drive?" she asked as she slid a worn leather fob across the counter. "Longer than I expected," I admitted. My voice sounded different, raw, stripped of the usual polish I wore around my family. My room faced the ocean. When I opened the door, the sound of waves rushed in, steady and unbothered, as though the world beyond my family's orbit had been waiting all along. I set my bag on the bench and stood there, letting the silence arrive in stages. For the first time in years, no one was telling me to hand something over. No one was asking me to bend. The keys were still in my pocket, solid and mine. And for the first time, I believed I didn't have to give them up. I woke to the sound of waves instead of Daniel's voice. For a moment, disoriented, I thought I was dreaming. The curtains of the inn room swayed slightly in the morning breeze, and through the crack I could see the ocean stretched out like a sheet of hammered silver. My first conscious thought was simple and shocking: no one needed anything from me. The room itself was modest, white bedding, a small writing desk, a window seat tucked into the corner, but it felt like a prize, not because of luxury but because it was mine. I hadn't been assigned it, negotiated it, or given it up for someone else. I had chosen it, paid for it, claimed it. That small act alone felt revolutionary. Downstairs, the inn's lobby smelled of coffee and fresh muffins. The woman at the desk, her name tag read Clara, pointed me toward a tray of fruit and said, "Help yourself." No fuss, no performance, no judgment. Just kindness. I filled a plate with strawberries and poured coffee into a mug that warmed my hands. Settling into a corner table, I listened to the chatter of other travelers planning hikes or whale-watching tours. Nobody here knew me as Daniel's sister, or Frank's daughter, or Marjorie's strong one. I was just Isabelle, a woman eating breakfast by the sea. Afterward, I set out on one of the coastal trails Clara had recommended. The path wound through cypress trees and opened onto cliffs where the ocean hurled itself against black rocks, foaming and relentless. The air was cool and sharp, filling my lungs in a way that felt cleansing. Every step away from the inn seemed to strip off another layer of expectation I hadn't realized I was carrying. I paused at an overlook where the land dropped sharply to the waves. The horizon stretched endlessly, a line that didn't care about family dramas or unspoken rules. For the first time in years, I felt small in a way that was comforting, not diminishing. Small, but free. My phone buzzed in my pocket. For a long moment I considered ignoring it, but curiosity won. I pulled it out to find a string of unread messages lighting up the screen. Dad, you embarrassed me last night. We'll talk when you're calm. Mom, honey, please. Daniel didn't mean to upset you. Just come back so we can enjoy the weekend together. Daniel, hope you're having fun playing martyr. We're fine without you. The words hit with the dull thud of familiarity. Same script, different day. My father minimizing, my mother pleading, my brother mocking. For years, I had read those lines and bent myself back into their mold. But here, with the sea roaring in my ears and the cliffs solid under my feet, the messages felt smaller, like echoes from another world. I powered the phone off. The silence that followed was staggering. Back at the inn, I sat by the window seat with my notebook open. At first, the pages stayed blank. I hadn't journaled in years. It always felt self-indulgent, like there wasn't room in my life for my own thoughts. But slowly the words came. I wrote the bare facts first. He grabbed my hand. I said no. I left. Then the truths beneath them. It wasn't about the car. It was about a lifetime of giving in. The pen moved faster, lines tumbling onto the page until my hand cramped. By the time I stopped, the knot in my chest had loosened. That evening, I walked down to the cliffs again. The sun bled orange across the water, and the wind tugged at my hair. Couples strolled by holding hands, kids darted along the path, someone played a guitar softly in the distance. I didn't feel lonely. I felt present. As though the space I usually gave away had finally come back to me. Back in my room, I made tea from the complimentary basket and carried it out to the little porch. The stars blinked to life one by one, unbothered by my family's chaos hundreds of miles south. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and whispered into the night, I'm not going back to who I was. The ocean answered with its steady rhythm, as if to say, hold your line. The inn's breakfast room was quiet the next morning, sunlight spilling across the wooden tables. I had just sat down with a plate of toast and fruit when a woman in her 40s asked if she could join me. She carried herself with the kind of ease I envied, shoulders relaxed, eyes bright, like she wasn't carrying invisible weights. Sure, I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. She set down her coffee and offered her hand. Harper. Isabelle, I replied, shaking it. She smiled knowingly, as if she'd already guessed something about me. You here for the views or the escape? The question startled me. I almost laughed. Escape, I guess. Same, she said simply, stirring cream into her coffee. We fell into easy conversation. Harper told me she was from Sacramento, recently divorced after a long marriage that had left her drained. She had come to Mendocino for what she called a reset weekend. I asked her what that meant, and she leaned back, considering. Sometimes, she said, you live so long in a role that you forget who you are outside it. Wife, mother, daughter. You get used to bending, to making yourself small. And then one day you realize you're not living, you're just reacting. Her words struck me with the force of recognition. I hadn't thought of my life in those terms, but it fit. I had spent 29 years reacting to Daniel's needs and my parents' demands, bending until I barely knew where I ended and they began. You sound like you know what that feels like, Harper said gently, studying me over her coffee mug. I hesitated, then told her the bare outline, the trip, the car keys, my father's hand clamping down, the moment I finally said no. I expected judgment or maybe polite discomfort. Instead, Harper nodded slowly, as if she'd been there herself. Good, she said. You drew a line. It didn't feel good, I admitted. It felt terrifying. And now I don't know what comes next. They think I'm selfish. Maybe I am. Harper shook her head. That's the trap. People who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always call you selfish when you set them. It doesn't make it true. I stared at her, the words settling into me like stones on steady ground. She leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. Here's the thing about boundaries, they're not requests. They're rules. And they only work if you keep them. The first time you give in, people learn they can push again. But if you hold the line, consistently, they start to adjust. Not overnight. Not easily. But they do. I felt something shift inside me, like a puzzle piece snapping into place. I had always thought of boundaries as pleading, please don't treat me this way. But Harper framed them as firm and unshakable, I will not accept being treated this way. The difference was seismic. We talked for over an hour, about her divorce, about the years she spent shrinking to keep peace, about the messy process of reclaiming herself. She told me about therapy, about books that helped, about nights she cried on her bathroom floor but still held her line. It's not glamorous, she said with a rueful smile, but it's freedom. When she finally stood to leave, she touched my shoulder lightly. You're further along than you think, Isabelle. You said no. That's the hardest part. After she left, I sat staring at my coffee, her words echoing. Boundaries only work if you keep them. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the cliffs again, the wind whipping hair across my face. The ocean roared, relentless, refusing to shrink for anyone. I realized that was what Harper meant, not bending until I disappeared, but holding steady like the tide, consistent and unapologetic. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the capable one holding everything together. I felt like someone who could choose what to hold and what to let go. And I knew, when I eventually faced my family again, I would have to keep that line, no matter how loudly they protested. The next few days unfolded like nothing I'd ever experienced. No alarm clock set to someone else's schedule, no agendas dictated by Daniel's whims or my parents' expectations. Just me, the ocean, and time that belonged entirely to myself. The first morning after meeting Harper, I laced up my sneakers and followed a trail that wound along the cliffs. The air was sharp with salt, and gulls wheeled overhead, their cries high and untamed. My body felt heavy at first, as though weighed down by years of invisible obligations, but the longer I walked, the lighter I became. The path opened onto a bluff where the Pacific stretched endless and merciless. I stood there until the wind numbed my cheeks, my chest expanding with each breath like I hadn't breathed fully in years. That afternoon, I pulled out my sketchbook. I had carried it for months, buried in the bottom of my work bag, never touched. At the inn, I spread it open across the desk by the window. The first lines came hesitant, shaky, like a language I'd half forgotten. But soon shapes took form, cypress trees bending toward the sea, waves curling in layered blues. Hours passed unnoticed. For once, the lines I drew weren't for a client or a deadline, they were mine. When evening came, I carried tea out to the porch and watched the stars scatter themselves across the black sky. I had lived most of my life in noise, family noise, city noise, workplace noise, but here the silence wrapped around me like something holy. And in that silence, I began to hear my own voice again. On the third day, I drove up the coast without a destination. The road clung to the cliffs, each curve revealing another stretch of ocean crashing below. I stopped at a pull-off where wildflowers grew stubbornly between rocks, bright bursts of color against the gray stone. I took pictures, not to post or prove anything, but simply to remember. My phone stayed off, tucked in my bag like a sleeping creature I didn't dare wake. The thought of my parents' messages, Dad's clipped commands, Mom's guilty pleas, Daniel's smug taunts, no longer filled me with dread. They felt distant, like a storm I had outrun. The silence was more than peace, it was space to realize how much of my life had been dictated by others. One night, I wrote in my journal until my hand cramped. I listed every moment I could remember when I had given something up: the science fair ribbon ignored, the Honda I bought myself while Daniel was gifted a Jeep, the countless family dinners where conversation shifted to him the moment I opened my mouth. The list grew pages long, a ledger of quiet thefts. But as I looked at it, instead of sadness, I felt clarity. The weight of those moments wasn't mine to carry anymore. I closed the notebook and whispered into the dark room, "I see you. And I'm done." The words startled me, like they'd come from a part of myself I hadn't spoken to in years. But they felt true. On the fourth morning, I walked down to the cliffs again. A fisherman was casting lines into the waves, his silhouette dark against the rising sun. He nodded at me, and I nodded back, no need for words. The tide was coming in, steady, unbothered. I thought of Harper's voice: "Boundaries only work if you keep them." I realized then that solitude wasn't loneliness. Loneliness was being in a room full of people who didn't see me. Solitude was being alone and finally seeing myself. When I turned back toward the inn, my chest felt lighter, my steps firmer. I wasn't healed overnight. Life isn't a movie where one bold choice fixes everything. But I had tasted something I couldn't untaste: freedom. And I knew when the time came to face my family again, I would carry this piece of the ocean with me. Because for the first time in my life, I remembered who I was without them telling me. By the fifth day, I knew hiding wasn't an option forever. Mendocino had been a cocoon, a place where silence and salt air rebuilt the parts of me I thought were gone. But sooner or later, I had to face them. Not to apologize, never again to apologize for taking space, but to speak aloud what I had swallowed for 29 years. I texted Mom first. "Dinner tonight? Somewhere public." The reply came within seconds: "Yes, sweetheart. I'll make reservations." When I arrived at the restaurant in San Francisco, the city lights glittered off the bay, tourists streaming along the pier. The hostess led me to a booth near the back. My family was already there. Mom's eyes welled as soon as she saw me. She reached across the table, clutching my hand. "Oh, Isabelle. I'm so glad you came. We've been so worried." Dad didn't look worried. His jaw was set, his posture stiff, like he was bracing for battle. Daniel lounged beside him, scrolling on his phone, smirk tugging at his lips as if nothing had happened. I slid into my seat and let the silence stretch a beat too long. Then I said, "We need to talk." Dad jumped in first. "We do. About your behavior. Running off like that, ignoring our calls, it was childish and selfish. You embarrassed us." The old script. I almost laughed. Instead, I breathed slowly and answered, "No. What happened in that lobby was embarrassing. You grabbed me, Dad. In front of strangers. Over car keys." His nostrils flared. "Because you refused to cooperate. You always have to make things difficult." Mom squeezed my hand tighter. "Let's not fight. We're here to celebrate your father's birthday." Daniel snorted without looking up from his phone. "God, Izzy, you're still making it about you. It was just a car." I turned toward him, steady. "It was never just a car. It's every time I've had to give something up so you could take more. Every time my achievements didn't matter because yours had to shine. Every time Mom and Dad called me strong so they could neglect me. That's what it was." The words came out calmer than I expected, but they landed heavy. Mom's lip trembled. Dad's jaw worked. Daniel's smirk faltered, just a flicker, before he rolled his eyes. "Drama queen," he muttered. I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "Respect is the only way forward. If you can't treat me with it, I won't be part of this family dynamic anymore." Dad's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening to cut us off?" "I'm setting a boundary," I said. The word tasted solid, like stone. I won't let myself be treated like the background character in my own life. Not anymore. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. We didn't mean to make you feel invisible. You did, though, I said gently. Over and over again. And if you want me at this table, if you want me in your lives, that has to change. I'm not asking anymore, I'm telling you. The silence that followed was unlike any I had ever known with them. No quick pivot to Daniel, no smoothing over. Just the weight of my words settling across the table. The waiter appeared awkwardly, menus in hand, and the moment shattered. We ordered in clipped voices, each of us pretending we hadn't just ripped open decades of family truth. Dinner itself was strained. Dad kept his eyes on his plate, chewing like the food was responsible for his anger. Mom asked me stilted questions about work, her voice too bright. Daniel sulked, poking at his burger. But beneath it all, I felt something shift. A crack in the old armor, small but real. As we stood to leave, Dad muttered, almost grudgingly, "We'll talk more later." I nodded. "We will." Walking out into the night air, I realized I wasn't trembling. My heart wasn't racing. I had said my truth and survived it. More than that, I had finally been heard, even if they didn't want to admit it yet. For the first time in my life, I left a family dinner not feeling smaller, but taller. The weeks after that dinner felt strangely quiet. I had braced myself for an explosion, for Dad to double down, for Mom to barrage me with tearful calls, for Daniel to mock me until I caved. But instead, the storm never came. What I got instead were small shifts, barely noticeable at first, like cracks forming in a wall I'd assumed was impenetrable. The first came 2 days later, in the form of a phone call from Dad. I almost didn't answer, my chest tightened just seeing his name on the screen, but curiosity won. His voice was gruff, uncomfortable. "About the hotel," he said without preamble. "I shouldn't have grabbed your hand. That was out of line." I was so startled I almost dropped the phone. My father never apologized. Not once in 29 years. "Thank you," I said, careful to keep my tone neutral. He cleared his throat. "Doesn't mean I agree with how you handled things. But I was wrong there." It wasn't a sweeping change, not an admission of everything I'd laid out at dinner. But it was something. A chip in the armor. The second shift came from Mom. A week later, she called while I was eating lunch at my desk. Her voice was tentative, softer than usual. "How's work going?" she asked. I waited for the catch, for the conversation to veer back to Daniel's latest endeavor, but it didn't. She actually listened. I told her about a new campaign I was designing, about the late nights and the thrill of seeing something I created go live. She asked questions, awkward at first, but genuine. For the first time, I felt like she saw me, not just the shadow standing behind my brother. Daniel, of course, didn't change overnight. At a family barbecue a month later, he still strutted around like the center of the universe. But when he started to make a snide remark about me being the dramatic one, Dad cut him off with a sharp, "That's enough." I nearly choked on my iced tea. It wasn't a miracle. Daniel sulked for the rest of the afternoon, complaining about how everyone was too sensitive now. But the fact that Dad had drawn a line, however small, was a first. I noticed changes in myself, too. When Mom asked if I could help Daniel move apartments last minute, the old reflex to say yes tugged at me. But I paused, breathed, and said, "No, I can't. I already have plans." My heart pounded as I waited for the guilt trip, the accusation of selfishness. Instead, Mom hesitated, then said, "All right. I'll tell him." The world didn't end. The sky didn't fall. Saying no felt like unlocking a door I hadn't known was there. Not everything was easy. There were tense dinners where Daniel glowered at me across the table, where Dad retreated into silence, where Mom tried too hard to play peacemaker. But I held my line, steady and calm, repeating the words Harper had given me, "Boundaries only work if you keep them." Each time I stood firm, I felt that line grow stronger, less like an experiment and more like part of who I was. One evening, Dad called just to talk. No demands, no scolding. He asked about a project I was working on, told me about a house he was managing, even laughed when I teased him about finally learning how to use the family group chat properly. It was the kind of conversation I'd longed for as a teenager, casual and equal. When I hung up, I sat staring at my phone, a strange mix of gratitude and grief swelling in my chest. Gratitude for the crack in the wall. Grief for all the years wasted without it. Daniel remained the hardest. He pushed, tested, sulked. But even he seemed to recognize something had shifted. He still complained when Mom didn't rush to fix his mistakes, still expected special treatment, but his eyes flicked toward me now, gauging whether I'd push back. And sometimes, when I caught him off guard, there was something else there, something like respect, though he'd never admit it. The cracks weren't dramatic, but they were real. And for the first time, I believed the wall could crumble, piece by piece, if I just kept holding my ground. One night, sitting by my apartment window with a cup of tea, I wrote in my journal, "They're changing. Slowly. But so am I. And maybe that's enough for now." I closed the notebook and let the city hum around me, feeling lighter than I had in years. Months passed, and life in Milwaukee settled into something that felt both familiar and entirely new. On the surface, not much had changed. I still went to work at the design firm, still filled my weekends with errands, coffee runs, and the occasional dinner with friends. But inside, the shift was unmistakable. The Isabelle who had returned from Mendocino wasn't the same woman who had driven out of San Francisco with shaking hands and a pocket full of keys. For one thing, I stopped waiting for recognition that would never come. At work, when I finished a big project, I didn't rush to text my parents, fishing for their approval. I celebrated with my team, or sometimes just by myself, with takeout sushi and a sketchbook. I learned that I didn't need their applause to validate what I had achieved. But the most surprising part was the way my family began to slowly, awkwardly, adjust around me. Dad called more often. Not long, drawn-out conversations, but enough to matter. Sometimes he asked about my projects, other times he just wanted to chat about a Brewers game or the weather. Once, he admitted he was proud of how I'd built something of my own. The words were clumsy, but they landed like a long-delayed gift. Mom, too, seemed to be practicing. She caught herself once when she started to gush about Daniel's latest job change, and instead asked me about a trip I was planning. "You've always been adventurous," she said, almost shyly, as if she were relearning who I was. Daniel remained Daniel, restless, entitled, always angling for the spotlight. But even he seemed wary of pushing too far. At Thanksgiving, when he tried to commandeer the evening with one of his stories, Dad cut him off and asked me to share about a recent project. Daniel sulked, but I didn't. For once, the room tilted in my direction, and I didn't shrink from it. The truth is, they weren't transformed overnight. They were still the same people with the same habits. But the dynamic had shifted, and so had I. I no longer walked into family gatherings bracing to be erased. I walked in knowing I had a line, and that I could hold it. The desert, or rather, the cliffs of Mendocino, remained with me. Whenever life in Milwaukee pressed too tightly, I found myself driving north along Lake Michigan, parking by the water, breathing in the waves until I remembered that sense of vastness. That freedom wasn't tied to a location, it was something I carried inside me now. One Saturday, I packed a small bag and drove back to Mendocino. The inn was as quiet as I remembered, the ocean still relentless against the rocks. Clara at the desk smiled as if she recognized me, though she didn't say so. I checked into a room that faced the water and spent the weekend sketching, hiking, and listening to the waves. On my last night there, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, tea steaming in my hands. The stars blinked awake one by one, the same stars that had watched me months earlier when I'd first whispered, "I'm not going back to who I was." I thought about Harper and her words, "Boundaries only work if you keep them." I thought about the girl I had been, the capable one, the invisible one, and how she had carried so much weight without recognition. I thought about the woman I was becoming, someone who could say no without apology, someone who could walk away when respect wasn't offered. And for the first time, I felt the difference not just as defiance, but as peace. When I drove back to Milwaukee the next day, I didn't feel like I was returning to the same life. I was bringing something new with me, something unshakable. My parents might slip, Daniel might push, but I knew I could hold the line. Because the truth was simple, though it had taken me 29 years to learn it, I didn't need their approval to exist. I didn't need their applause to matter. I had my own foundation now, built on cliffs and silence, on sketches and starlight, on the steady rhythm of waves that refused to bow. I was finally driving my own road. And I wasn't giving up the keys again. This was my story. If you've ever been the one expected to always give in, or had a breaking point with your family, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your story too. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button.